And now, for a Captain Adams VHS Pirate Ship special presentation. Last time on Into the Microverse, we explored the history of arcades and the origin of the miniature arcade cabinet as the world was introduced to the concept of Coleco's revolutionary miniaturized versions of arcade favorites, their subtle rise to power, their mysterious 2-decade-long disappearance, and their resurgence in the 2000s with Bandai and Basic Fun Incorporated's newer and even smaller versions of arcade classics. And we briefly discussed the long history of arcade heavy hitters such as Pac-Man and Frogger, and their miniaturized arcade cabinet counterparts, including Basic Fun Incorporated's absolutely inexcusable version of Pac-Man. We covered a lot of ground, but there's still many more miles to go. So where's our journey heading next? Find out as we go even further into the Microverse! The 80s, the new medium of entertainment known as video games, was coming into blossom. And in the early years of that decade, video games were becoming a powerful market. And that market prowess spilled out of the arcades and into homes with the revolutionary home video game systems. Most notable being the Atari and ColecoVision. And Coleco decided there was another, cheaper and easier way to bring the arcade experience home with the invention of the miniaturized arcade cabinet. Now, these weren't very good versions of these games, but it got the point across and they were pretty successful as they sold very well, and it was further proof that video games made money. So video games soon became cemented as a profitable market. Between the cartoon shows, merchandise, and even home decor, video games were certainly proving their worth. And even though at the time they were still a blossoming medium, video games in the early 80s were a marketing juggernaut, and there was no shortage of video games, and within those video games there was no shortage of lovable characters, because game designers figured out pretty quickly that if you wanted your game to be successful, you had to have some personality, and with that personality you had to have memorable characters. And last time we discussed Pac-Man and Frogger, two of the best examples of the said memorable video game characters. Of course, this concept would not stop with these two examples, and having memorable video game characters would be a theme that rolled on all the way into the present. Got your Marios, got your Sonics, got your Crash Bandicoots, got your Link, got your Bonk, got your Donkey Kong. Well, you get the point. And that's not to say that if a video game did not have memorable characters, it wouldn't be successful, as is the case for Space Invaders and Galaga, two games that were very successful and involved no characters whatsoever. And I guess that's because sometimes you don't want to be bothered with backstory or personality. Sometimes you just want to shoot ships. But then, sometimes you do want to be part of a character's story, their personal development and life journey. Now, I know that's a bit much, but it sounds good, and I didn't really know how else to put it, so you know. And having characters in video games makes us more personally involved in them, and it makes the whole thing just seem like it means a whole lot more. And for game developers, having a character in a video game means the potential for more merchandise. But having a character in a video game doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be successful, and sometimes it doesn't always work as well as the developers would like. Such is the case for Mappy, which was released in arcades in 1983, which is about the exploits of a mouse cop who's hunting down cat capers. And that's an interesting concept, certainly a unique one, and though it was a big hit at the time of its release, it just didn't have what they call staying power, which means the popularity it had just wasn't going to last. And I know that many of you probably regard this as an arcade classic, yada yada yada. You need to know that most people don't know what Mappy is. You ask most people about Pac-Man or Frogger, they know what you're talking about. You ask them about Mappy, they have no clue. Even though, at the time of its release, Mappy was on the same level as Pac-Man and Frogger. But that arcade accolade just would not stick, and surprisingly enough, Mappy would eventually enjoy a miniaturized arcade cabinet. But we are talking eventually in all caps, because this wouldn't be a thing until 2018, which is pretty long to wait when you consider that micro cabinets have been being cranked out since 1981. And that's interesting, and I'll explain why. So the gimmick of a miniaturized arcade cabinet has to be of an arcade game that's a classic, that's a favorite, that people love. meaning the manufacturers aren't going to make one if it's not going to sell, which is why games like Pac-Man and Frogger have had incarnations in any line of micro arcade cabinets that exist. Hell, they were the first ones ever made, and they still make them today. So if Mappy was on the same level as Pac-Man and Frogger, why didn't it get a miniaturized arcade cabinet until 2018? Well, I'm guessing it just didn't seem like it would be worth it for the manufacturers. You may consider Mappy an arcade classic, but it seems like no one else did. Well, Coleco and Basic Fun Incorporated sure as hell didn't, which, as we talked about in part 1, were the primary purveyors of the miniaturized arcade cabinet. So if these two major and seemingly only names in the miniaturized arcade cabinet game didn't care about Mappy, then who did? Mappy would eventually get its just due and join the micro ranks of the miniaturized arcade cabinet in 2018 by a company simply called My Arcade. And they are a new player in the miniaturized arcade cabinet game, and we will talk plenty more about them as this series continues. So Mappy was a video game character that was meant to stand right alongside Pac-Man, Frogger, and Donkey Kong, but for whatever reason, that just didn't happen. Even though he is a mouse cop, which is a very original idea, and the game itself is very fun, time just didn't smile upon it. Even though you may remember Mappy, and video game history certainly does, the world does not. Just like you start talking about Space Invaders and everybody's a video game expert, but the minute you bring up Moon Patrol, people want you committed. But anyways, Mappy was a video game character that just didn't stick. However, there were other video game characters besides Pac-Man, Frogger, and Donkey Kong that would stand the test of time. And today, we're going to take a look at some of these other video game characters and some video games that didn't have characters but were still very memorable. And of course, we're going to dive into their miniaturized arcade cabinet versions as we continue our excursions with part 2 of Into the Microverse! Prepare for miniaturization. Initiating a miniaturization sequence in 3, 2, 1. Initiate. Miniaturize! 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 VHS Pirate Ship presents Into the Microverse! So we've established that having a memorable character in your video game certainly would help its success, especially if that game was unique and challenging, yet delightful and enjoyable and borderline addictive. And having a memorable character in your video game would most certainly help it stand out. That part is very important when you consider that in the early 80s, the video game market was flooded. And even though it had pretty much just started, that market was oversaturated. So having a game that stood out amongst all the others was very important. You wanted a factor to make people look twice at your video game and say, hey, I would love to waste my money on that. The best way to do that was to give your game a little personality. Give it a lovable character. Give that character a backstory. Give that character a world to live in. Make the game attractive and seem like it would be worthwhile to play. And for God's sakes, don't make another space battle game. Seriously, how many of those were there? Galaxian, Galaga, Defender. Man, back then it seemed like every other video game was about a space battle. Asteroids, Gorf, Star Wars. Yep, sure was a lot of them. Scramble, Moon Patrol, Space Invaders. All right, jeez. But that reminds me, it's debatable whether or not Space Invaders is actually a space battle game. It doesn't take place in space, and as far as I know, it's not on a different planet. So, is this a space battle game? Well, anyways, it's close enough. Back to my point, and that is, in an oversaturated market, you wanted your product to stand out. And I'm not saying all those space battle games weren't successful, because obviously they're classics. And they made a lot of money, and people loved them, this, that, and the third. But if you wanted to make your video game stand out, it had to be different. It couldn't have been a space battle game. If you made a space battle game back then, it would be like, I don't know, opening a pizza shop. Because God knows there isn't enough of them. Jeez, talk about an oversaturated market. Well, Mr. Johnson, what would you like this business loan for? Well, I'd like to open a pizzeria. Okay, great. That's pretty original. Tell you what, I'll save us some time and I'll just go ahead and set this money on fire myself. Great, thanks. The joke here is that the pizzeria market is so flooded, the probability of success of the pizzeria this gentleman wishes to open is slim. And if the bank in question were to approve such a loan, they would get no return on their investment and the loan itself would be in default. Therefore, it would be a poor decision and a waste of money on the bank's behalf. Hence the punchline of setting the money on fire. Though we wish Mr. Johnson the best in his endeavors, it would not be economically viable for the bank to approve such a loan. Thanks for listening. So good luck if you own a pizza shop nowadays, and luck would be on your side back in the early 80s if you were a video game creator and put a lovable character in your video game. Especially if that character was a cute, bipedal, fuzzy, orange, tubular-nosed, seemingly foul-mouthed little thing. And if that cute little unassuming character was placed in a video game with unique gameplay such as hopping around a pyramid, changing tiles into different colors, well, you might have a hit on your hands. Not only would you have a hit on your hands, you would have also created another memorable video game character and an 80s icon. If you haven't figured out what I'm talking about by now, well, let's expand on that and let's talk about Q-Bert. Q-Bert! Motherfucker! Released in arcades in 1982, Q-Bert would go on to have massive success almost instantly. Not only was it a very cleverly designed game and basically addictive, the character of Q-Bert was an immediate hit. This game most certainly stood out amongst all the other video games back then, and well, it still does. And the character Q-Bert is very lovable. As far as memorable video game characters go, he was on the same level as Pac-Man, and like Pac-Man, would go on to represent 80s imagery. Also like Pac-Man, Q-Bert would be so popular that there would be no shortage of merchandise for the little orange fuzzy guy. And also like Pac-Man, Q-Bert would have his own cartoon show. Wait, why is he wearing a varsity jacket? Q-Bert would become further proof that if a video game became so popular, it would break the floodgates of its medium and the raging torrent would spill out through all other aspects of popular culture. Q-Bert was also famous for having a delightful little endearing trait, and that is cussing. Well, not really. He would cuss in what we assume to be his own little language, and this would happen when he lost, or when you lost, which is reflective of reality, because if you play Q-Bert, you're going to be cussing a lot. Yeah, for all its delightful imagery and fun gameplay, Q-Bert is really freaking hard. All difficulty aside, Q-Bert would go on to be an arcade classic, and being an arcade classic meant it had an incarnation in every line of miniature arcade cabinets that's ever existed. Well, practically. And in part 1, I had said that Q-Bert was part of the original Coleco mini cabinets, but it wasn't. Coleco never made a Q-Bert mini cabinet, but Parker Brothers did. In 1983, Parker Brothers released their own line of arcade mini cabinets, and by own line, I mean just one, and that's Q-Bert, and by mini cabinets, I mean sort of. I mean, this doesn't look like an arcade cabinet, does it? The answer is no. But it got the point across, and it sold very well. And recently, someone made a homebrew version of a Coleco miniature cabinet of Q-Bert. Oh, how clever. And the Parker Brothers quote-unquote mini arcade cabinet would not be the only time Q-Bert would have a smaller version. Just like Pac-Man and Frogger, Q-Bert is always on the list when it comes to any kind of marketing pertaining to arcade classics. And later on, in the 2000s, Basic Fun Incorporated certainly applied this theory, as Q-Bert was part of their second wave of their first attempt at the miniature arcade cabinet. And yes, it pretty much sucks, but I tell you what, it's still better than that shitty version of Pac-Man! And in 2016, Basic Fun Incorporated would have another go at the miniaturized arcade cabinet and would release a new and improved line of micro arcade classics. And Q-Bert, being an arcade classic, would be on that list. And this version is pretty decent. As you can see, it looks pretty good. Nice colors, nice animation. But how is the sound? It's not too bad. It's crisp, it's bright, it's clear. This is a pretty damn decent and enjoyable version of Q-Bert. How's the gameplay? Well, it's a bit awkward, but that's how it goes with these mini cabinets. As I had mentioned in part 1, and I'm going to mention it plenty more times because awkward gameplay is a resounding factor in these things, the size makes it sort of hard to play. But Q-Bert, like Pac-Man and Frogger, only requires a joystick to control it. So the awkwardness is at a minimum, and this game controls okay. It does get sort of sticky. However, I'm not sure if it's because of my big ham hands or if that's how the game actually works. Though this is a delightful version of Q-Bert's and a pretty good minicab rendition, sticky controls and the small size just makes it rather bumbling to play. However, it's not as awkward as it could be, but that's the nature of the beast when it comes to mini cabinets, and as I had mentioned in part 1, you gotta give up a little bit of function for the form. And as we're going to talk about later on in the series, there are some games that just do not translate well into miniature cabinets. So as we discussed earlier, sometimes having a memorable character in your game is not enough to make the game itself memorable, even if there are numerous factors that make the game unique and distinguishable amongst all others. And even if that game is a big success at the time of its release, it does not guarantee it's going to be remembered through time. And Mappy wasn't the only game/video game character to have such a fate. Another good example of this particular scenario would be Mr. Do, who was a little clown character in a very delightful game. Released in arcades in 1982, Mr. Do had all the makings for the next big thing. It was a tremendous success in both the US and Japan, and even had 3 sequels. But soon after the mid-80s hit, people just seemed to forget about old Mr. Do. And yes, it's the same story for Mappy, wherein you may know what Mr. Do is, but understand the world does not. Also, as in the case of Mappy, Mr. Do is a lovable character in a unique game that just did not seem to stick in the world's memory. Further proof of this, Mr. Do has never gotten an arcade mini cabinet. And that's where this example differs from Mappy, because Mappy did eventually get a mini cabinet, but it sure took him long enough. And hey, maybe we'll have a mini Mr. Do in the future. Who knows? So it would seem that Mr. Do is an unsung video game hero. And when I said that Mr. Do was a unique game, well, that was kinda true. Because it has been said that Mr. Do was inspired by another unsung video game hero, and therefore unsung video game. A game that seemed like it was going to be on the same par as Pac-Man and Q-Bert, but for whatever reason, the stars just didn't line up. And for some people, this game is on the same par as Pac-Man and Q-Bert. So let's talk about it. Let's dig into it, if you will, with our next game, Zig Dug. Zig Dug! Zig Dug burrowed its way into arcades in 1982 and was extremely successful, featuring not only delightfully addictive gameplay, a unique new video game hero with cute little cartoonish enemies to match, and a distinctive video game experience, which at the time was a breath of fresh air, considering that you're up to your asteroids in space battle games. Zig Dug was different, very different. The point of the game is to dig around the level, gaining points for doing so, and clearing the board of enemies. And you can defeat these enemies in one of 2 ways. 1, dropping a boulder on them, crushing them to smithereens. Or 2, injecting a pump into them and inflating them until they burst. Wow, pretty gruesome for such a delightful and cartoonish game. But it's one of the things that makes this game unique and memorable. The other would be the hero himself, Zig Dug. Or at least I think that's his name. Is that his name? Or is it just Doug? Or what? Well, I don't know. Either way, Zig Dug gave us a new video game hero. But would he be on the same par as other video game heroes such as Pac-Man or Q-Bert or Frogger? Or would he suffer the same fate as Mappy and Mr. Do, where he started off memorable, but eventually faded from the world's reckoning. Well, I'd say that Dig Dug is a bit of a gray area, because depending on who you ask, he is on the same level as Pac-Man and Q-Bert. And I'd also say that most people would know Dig Dug before they would Mr. Do. And Dig Dug usually is included when it comes to any kind of conversation about arcade classics. And Dig Dug, of course, is an arcade classic, but you could say he's more like a B-list arcade classic. And though many people do consider Dig Dug on the same par as Pac-Man and Q-Bert, the merchandising for Dig Dug certainly was not there. For whatever reason, companies just did not feel that Dig Dug was that marketable. Though we wish Mr. Dug the best in all his endeavors, we do not feel it is economically viable to sign a merchandising contract at this time. Thanks for listening. I don't really see why. I mean, there's a lot to work with when it comes to Dig Dug. Dig Dug is certainly more tangible, merchandising-wise, than Pac-Man. Think about it. Pac-Man was just a circle, yet they found a million ways to market him. Most times, they even changed Pac-Man's design to make him more merchandisingly palatable. You got this design where he's just a weird little squib thing, and then Coleco released a line of PVC figures where he's just a ball with arms and legs. And with the cartoon, they said screw it and just made him a sphere with limbs. And look what they went with for the cover art for the Atari 400 version. That is really not what I thought Pac-Man would look like. And look, he's wearing a tank top with Pac-Man on it. The point is, Pac-Man should have been really hard to make merchandise for, and Dig Dug has so much meat on the bone to work with. Why didn't they make merchandise for that? It's surprising because this was at a time wherein video game merchandise was always a huge seller. And further proof that everyone thought Dig Dug was not marketable is that they never had a mini cabinet for it. Nope, Coleco never did one, even though I said they did in part 1. Again, I'm sorry, it was a mistake. This is a custom cabinet. Yes, this is yet another homebrew version of a Dig Dug Coleco mini cabinet. How clever. Hey, it fooled me, and this really should have been something Coleco did. But no, Dig Dug would not get an arcade mini cabinet until 2016 with the second line of the Basic Fun Incorporated's arcade classics. And Dig Dug would have another miniature arcade cabinet life in 2019 when My Arcade released their Namco Classics collection. And just look at this. What a nice version of Dig Dug. Just looking at it on its face, it's very aesthetically pleasing. The cabinet art is damn near accurate to the actual arcade cabinet. So it actually looks like a mini version of the original Dig Dug arcade machine.
Oh, it's like a baby Dig Dug.
Yes, this certainly looks the part and is very impressive. But how does it look game-wise? How does it play? How does it sound? Well, let's find out. It plays great. The controls don't stick. It's not very awkward to play. It seems to be just the right size. Though I must say there is something a little off with the actual game here. I'm not sure what it is. Oh, I know what it is. In fact, all of these My Arcade mini cabinets have a grisly secret, which we'll get into as the series continues. It's a great version of Dig Dug, but Dig Dug's fun no matter what. You can have a shitty version of it and still have a pretty good time. Though I don't know, if they released a shitty version of Dig Dug like the shitty version of Pac-Man, I would probably think differently. But this is pretty good, and you don't even have to play it to appreciate it. They did a great job with the design. It's a damn near perfect miniature replicant of the original arcade cabinet. And it's a nice little piece of nostalgia represented in a very well done miniature arcade game. Okay, so it looks good, plays pretty good, but how does it sound? It sounds tremendous. Sounds like Dig Dug, and you know, I just can't get enough of this cute little song. Dig Dug is just such a fun game, even though it has some pretty ghastly ways of dispatching your enemies. But cruel, unnecessary, and ghastly deaths are all part of the fun when it comes to Dig Dug. Dig Dug is tons of fun, delightful, and unique, and it's not really hard to play, because most arcade classics are pretty damn challenging. I'm a Dig Dug fan. I think he's an unsung video game hero, and this version of Dig Dug is very well done. It looks great, and it's not that awkward to play, and many other mini cabinets can't make such a boast. So as we proceed further into the Microverse, thus far we've discussed video game characters, both memorable and not so memorable, even though they really should be. The memorable video game characters, of course, were tremendously successful, and the not-so-memorable ones still had a great run. And all of these were treated to their own arcade mini-cabinets, except for Mr. Do for some reason. Come on, guys. No doubt, having a character in a video game will help that video game stand out, but the pixelized roads of arcade history wind here and there, hither and thither, and often land us in territory where a video game was tremendously successful, yet had no characters whatsoever. And being tremendously successful, these faceless games would be treated to their own arcade mini-cabinets. And as this series continues, we'll be discussing such games, so join me for part 3 of Into the Microverse! And be sure to hit subscribe. And take care out there, and I'll see you next time, only on Captain Adam's VHS pirate ship.